The air in the bedroom was cold, but David's heart burned with rage as he stared at the glowing screen of his phone. His wife, Elena, had always been meticulous with her belongings, never leaving her phone unlocked, until tonight. She was fast asleep, her face serene, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. David's hands trembled as he scrolled through the incriminating text messages she had exchanged with someone named Jake. The most recent message, sent just hours ago, read, "Last night was unforgettable. Let's make it our little secret." David's stomach churned. The words were a knife twisting deeper into his chest with every syllable. Elena had always been the love of his life, the woman he had built everything with. They had weathered storms together, or so he thought. But this was beyond betrayal. He closed the messaging app and opened her photo gallery, hoping, praying, that there was some mistake. But what he found was worse than he could have imagined. Hidden in an album labeled Work Docs were photos that left no room for doubt. Elena, with a man half-dressed, his arm draped around her shoulders in a dimly lit hotel room. David locked the phone and placed it carefully back on the nightstand. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing. Confronting her now, in the middle of the night, wouldn't accomplish anything. No, he needed a plan, a way to make her understand the depth of her betrayal and to ensure she faced the consequences. He turned and walked out of the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. In the quiet solitude of his home office, he sat down at his desk and stared at the blank notepad in front of him. "This isn't over," he whispered to himself. Not by a long shot. The rest of the night passed in a blur. David didn't sleep, he couldn't. Instead, he spent hours piecing together a timeline of her betrayal, starting with the clues he had overlooked. The late nights at work, the sudden obsession with her appearance, the distant behavior she brushed off as stress. By the time the sun rose, David had a plan. It wasn't just about confronting Elena. It was about dismantling the lies she had built and exposing the truth in a way she could never recover from. As Elena woke up and greeted him with a cheerful, "Morning, babe," David's mask of normalcy slipped into place. He smiled back, his tone steady. "Morning. Sleep well?" She nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. David sipped his coffee, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. David spent the day meticulously gathering every piece of evidence he could find. He combed through Elena's phone when she wasn't looking, copying messages, downloading incriminating photos, and noting locations and timestamps. He even checked her credit card statements, which revealed charges at a luxury hotel and a bar he'd never heard her mention. He knew he couldn't do this alone, so he called his friend Mark, a lawyer who had always been straightforward and trustworthy. "Mark, I need your help," David said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Mark listened intently as David laid out the situation. "I don't just want a divorce," David explained. "I want to make sure she doesn't walk away unscathed. I need to protect myself, legally and financially." Mark agreed to help, promising to draft the necessary documents and provide guidance on how to proceed. "But remember, David," Mark said, "keep your emotions in check. Revenge is fine, but make sure it's calculated. Don't let anger cloud your judgment." David nodded, his resolve hardening. This wasn't about acting out of anger. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring justice. That evening, David acted as though everything was normal. He kissed Elena on the cheek when she returned home, helped her set the table for dinner, and even laughed at her stories about her day. But beneath the surface, his mind was spinning, calculating every move. "Elena," he said casually as they ate, "how about we go out this weekend? It's been a while since we did something fun together." Her fork paused mid-air for a fraction of a second before she smiled. "That sounds great," she replied, her voice warm but slightly hesitant. David didn't press further. He knew her hesitation wasn't because of him. It was because of whatever plans she had made with Jake. The next morning, David put the second phase of his plan into action. He hired a private investigator to follow Elena, ensuring he would have irrefutable proof of her affair. The investigator, a sharp and discreet woman named Rachel, assured him that she would get all the evidence he needed. "Trust me," Rachel said. "I've seen it all before." People like her always slip up. David handed her a folder with everything he had already collected. This isn't just about catching her, he said. It's about making sure she can't deny it when the truth comes out. As the days passed, David played the role of the loving husband perfectly. He sent Elena sweet messages during the day, cooked dinner for her in the evenings, and even suggested a romantic getaway. But each time she smiled at him, pretending everything was fine. It only fueled his determination. When Rachel called him a few days later, her voice was calm but firm. "We've got her," she said. "Photos, videos, and enough details to leave no doubt. She's been meeting Jake at the hotel twice a week. They're bold, too. They didn't even try to hide it." David clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his phone. "Send me everything," he said. As the evidence flooded his inbox, David felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He finally had what he needed. Now, it was time to set the stage for the confrontation that would change everything. David spent the next few days meticulously preparing for the confrontation. Every detail had to be perfect. This wasn't just about exposing Elena's betrayal. It was about making sure she felt the full weight of her actions. He decided the best setting for the confrontation was their upcoming weekend getaway. Elena had enthusiastically agreed to the trip, thinking it was David's attempt to rekindle their romance. She even suggested a picturesque cabin in the mountains, a place that had always held sentimental value for them. David didn't argue. The isolation of the cabin would serve his purpose perfectly. On the morning of the trip, David packed their bags with an eerie sense of calm. Elena, meanwhile, was in high spirits, chatting about the activities they could do and the memories they would make. As they drove up the winding mountain roads, David feigned interest in her stories, his mind already running through the carefully laid-out plan. He had brought the folder of evidence, his laptop, and even a projector to ensure there would be no escape from the truth. By the time they arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the surrounding forest. Elena seemed relaxed, completely unaware of what was coming. That evening, after dinner, David poured 2 glasses of wine and suggested they sit by the fireplace. Elena smiled, taking her glass and settling into the cozy armchair opposite him. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately," David began, his tone calm but purposeful. Elena tilted her head, her smile faltering slightly. "Oh, what about us?" David took a sip of his wine, his gaze steady. "About how much I've trusted you, about how much I've loved you, and about how that trust has been shattered." Elena froze, her glass halfway to her lips. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice laced with nervous laughter. David set his glass down and pulled out the folder of evidence, placing it on the coffee table between them. "I know everything, Elena," he said evenly. "About you, about Jake, about the lies you've been feeding me for months." Elena's face drained of color as she stared at the folder. "David, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Don't insult me by pretending. I have texts, photos, videos, everything. Do you want to see for yourself? Or should I summarize?" Elena's hands trembled as she set her glass down. "David, please. It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," David snapped, his voice rising slightly. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, meeting him at hotels, lying to my face. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Tears filled Elena's eyes, but David didn't soften. "You've betrayed me, Elena. You've destroyed everything we built together, and now you're going to face the consequences." He stood, grabbing the laptop and projector he had set up earlier. Within moments, the living room was illuminated by a slideshow of incriminating photos. Each image was a nail in the coffin of their marriage. Elena and Jake holding hands, laughing at a bar, disappearing into a hotel room. Elena sobbed quietly, her head in her hands, but David didn't stop. "Do you see this?" he demanded, gesturing to the screen. "This is what you thought you could hide from me. This is what you thought wouldn't matter." When the slideshow ended, David turned off the projector and stood before her, his voice cold and unwavering. "You thought I wouldn't find out. You thought I'd never know. But here we are, Elena. Your perfect little secret is out. and there's no taking it back. Elena looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. David, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. A mistake? David scoffed, shaking his head. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something hurtful in the heat of the moment. This was deliberate, repeated, calculated. He grabbed the folder and threw it onto the table. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The divorce papers are ready. And trust me, you're not walking away from this unscathed. Elena sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking. Please, David, don't do this. I'll do anything to make it right. David's gaze was icy. You had your chance to make it right. Elena, you chose to betray me instead. He walked toward the door, pausing only to deliver one final blow. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. It's the last one you'll ever spend with me. And with that, he left the cabin, leaving Elena alone with her guilt, her lies, and the undeniable truth of what she had done. The drive back from the cabin was quiet, with only the hum of the car engine breaking the silence. David hadn't looked back once after leaving Elena in the cabin. He felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and the satisfaction of knowing he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. As the winding mountain roads gave way to the familiar streets of the city, David's focus shifted to the next phase of his plan. Confronting Elena had been cathartic, but it was just the beginning. Her betrayal deserved consequences that extended far beyond their personal confrontation. That evening, David sat in his home office, reviewing the evidence once more. The texts, photos, and videos weren't just tools for confrontation. They were the foundation for his next move. He wasn't just going to end their marriage. He was going to ensure that Elena's actions were exposed to the people she had worked so hard to impress. He drafted an email, attaching the most incriminating pieces of evidence. The recipient list included Elena's closest friends, her boss, and even her family. David didn't care about the backlash. He wanted the world to see her for who she truly was. Before sending the email, he hesitated. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Elena had manipulated him, lied to him, and humiliated him. She had taken their vows and torn them apart. He clicked send, feeling a sense of finality as the email left his outbox. The next morning, David's phone buzzed non-stop with notifications. Messages flooded in from mutual friends, expressing shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, support. I had no idea, one friend wrote. You didn't deserve this. But the most satisfying messages came from Elena's inner circle. Her boss, a stern woman with little tolerance for scandal, sent a curt response. This is unacceptable behavior. I'll be addressing this immediately. Elena's family, who had always viewed her as the perfect daughter, were stunned. Her sister called David, her voice trembling with anger. How could she do this? I can't believe it. David remained calm through every conversation, his responses measured. She made her choices, he said simply, and now she has to live with them. Meanwhile, Elena was dealing with the fallout. She had returned from the cabin to find her inbox flooded with messages. Friends she thought she could count on were distancing themselves, while her colleagues whispered behind her back. At work, her boss called her into a meeting. Elena, she said, her tone icy, we need to talk about your recent activities. This kind of behavior reflects poorly on our company. Effective immediately, you're on unpaid leave while we investigate. Elena's face burned with humiliation. Please, she begged. This has nothing to do with my job. It has everything to do with your character. Her boss interrupted. We value integrity here, Elena. And from what I've seen, you've compromised that. Back at home, Elena tried calling David, but he didn't answer. She left voicemail after voicemail, her voice growing more desperate with each one. David, please, we need to talk. I'm sorry. I know I messed up. But please don't do this to me. David listened to each message in silence before deleting them. Her apologies felt hollow, her regret too little, too late. As the days passed, the reality of her situation set in. Elena was isolated, jobless, and ostracized from her social circle. Jake, the man she had risked everything for, had stopped responding to her texts. He had no interest in being tied to the chaos her life had become. For the first time, Elena felt the full weight of her actions. The perfect life she had built was in ruins. And there was no one to blame but herself. As days turned into weeks, Elena's life spiraled further into disarray. She tried to salvage her reputation, reaching out to friends with carefully worded apologies and explanations. But none of them responded. Her closest confidants had either cut ties or avoided her entirely, unwilling to be associated with the fallout of her betrayal. Jake, the man she had sacrificed everything for, was nowhere to be found. His last message had been curt. "I think it's best we don't talk anymore." Elena had stared at the screen in disbelief, realizing that the man she thought cared for her had vanished at the first sign of trouble. Her once busy schedule was now empty, her days filled with silence and regret. She sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through social media and seeing glimpses of the life she had thrown away. Meanwhile, David's life had taken on a new rhythm. He embraced his freedom, focusing on rebuilding what Elena had tried to destroy. His work performance skyrocketed, earning him a promotion that came with a generous raise and new opportunities. His colleagues noticed the change in him. "You seem different," one of them said over lunch. "Like you've let go of something heavy." David smiled faintly. "You could say that, but it wasn't just work that flourished." David began reconnecting with old friends, people he had unintentionally distanced himself from during his marriage. They welcomed him back with open arms, reminding him of the support system he had always had. One evening, David received a call from Elena's sister, Sarah. Her voice was hesitant but firm. "David, I'm not calling to defend her," she said quickly. "What she did to you was unforgivable. But I'm worried about her. She's not in a good place." David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Sarah, I appreciate your concern, but Elena made her choices. She has to live with them." "I know," Sarah replied, her tone softening. "But I just thought you should know. She's completely alone." David thanked her for the call but didn't dwell on it. He had already spent too much time worrying about Elena's feelings. Now it was time to focus on his own happiness. As part of his healing process, David took up new hobbies: running in the mornings, joining a photography class, and even volunteering at a local shelter. Each activity brought him closer to rediscovering himself, the man he had been before the betrayal. During one of his photography classes, he met Claire, a vibrant and kind woman with an infectious laugh. They bonded over their shared love of art and quickly struck up a friendship that felt easy and natural. Claire didn't push for details about his past, but when David shared pieces of his story, she listened without judgment. "You've been through a lot," she said one evening as they walked through a park. "But you don't seem bitter." "That's rare." David shrugged. "Bitterness doesn't fix anything. I just want to move forward." As their friendship deepened, David began to feel something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Hope for a future that wasn't defined by betrayal or revenge, but by genuine connection and trust. Meanwhile, Elena's regret continued to consume her. She had lost everything: her husband, her job, her social circle, and she had no one to blame but herself. She often thought about calling David, but she knew it was pointless. He had moved on, while she remained stuck in the mess she had created. For the first time, Elena understood the gravity of her actions, and for the first time, she realized that some mistakes couldn't be undone. David's life continued to thrive as he leaned further into the things that brought him joy and fulfillment. His bond with Claire deepened, and their connection felt effortless, a stark contrast to the strained and performative dynamic he had endured with Elena. One afternoon, as David and Claire sat on a park bench overlooking a serene lake, she turned to him with a gentle smile. "You seem like someone who's been through a lot," she said, "but you've managed to come out stronger. How did you do it?" David paused, considering her words. "I think it's because I realized I deserved better. Better than betrayal, better than lies. And once I accepted that, it became easier to let go of the past." Claire placed her hand over his, her touch warm and reassuring. "You're right. You do deserve better. And I think you've found it." David smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Meanwhile, Elena's life had reached a breaking point. The shame of her actions had left her isolated, and the weight of regret was almost unbearable. Her apartment felt like a prison, filled with reminders of what she had lost. Desperate to find some semblance of closure, Elena decided to write David a letter. She poured out her guilt, her sorrow, and her apologies, hoping that putting her feelings into words might bring her some relief. When David received the letter a week later, he was surprised to see her handwriting on the envelope. He hesitated before opening it, unsure if he even wanted to know what she had to say. The letter was long and filled with apologies, admissions of guilt, and pleas for forgiveness. Elena acknowledged the pain she had caused and expressed regret for everything she had done. David read the letter carefully, but as he reached the final lines, he realized something profound. He didn't need her apology. He had already forgiven her, not for her sake, but for his own. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, deciding not to respond. Elena's journey was hers to navigate, just as his was his own. That evening, David and Claire attended a dinner party hosted by mutual friends. As they laughed and shared stories with the other guests, David felt a renewed sense of belonging. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder or dwelling on the past. Claire noticed his quiet reflection and leaned in. "You okay?" she asked softly. David nodded. "Better than okay," he said. "I feel free." Back in her apartment, Elena sat alone, staring at her phone. She had hoped for a response to her letter, but as the days passed in silence, she realized it wasn't coming. David had moved on, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She thought about everything she had taken for granted, the love, trust, and stability David had offered, and realized too late that she had thrown it all away. David's world had transformed into something he scarcely recognized, and for once, that was a good thing. With Claire by his side, his life felt full of possibilities. They spent weekends exploring new places, trying different cuisines, and sharing quiet evenings together. One weekend, Claire suggested a hike to a secluded mountaintop that promised breathtaking views. "It's a bit of a climb," she said with a playful grin, "but I promise it's worth it." David agreed, intrigued by her enthusiasm. As they ascended the trail, he couldn't help but marvel at how far he had come. Not just geographically, but emotionally. The man who had once been consumed by betrayal was now embracing a future full of hope. At the summit, they stood side by side, taking in the panoramic view of rolling hills and endless skies. Claire turned to him, her eyes bright. "You've really rebuilt your life, David," she said. "And it's beautiful to see." David smiled, a rare sense of pride washing over him. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted. "But I've learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to realize what really matters." As they descended the mountain, David felt lighter, as though he had left the last remnants of his pain at the summit. Meanwhile, Elena's world remained stagnant. She had exhausted her savings trying to maintain a semblance of her old life. But the financial strain was catching up to her. Job applications went unanswered, and her once busy social calendar was empty. In a desperate bid to regain some control, Elena decided to attend a networking event hosted by an old acquaintance. She hoped to reconnect with people who might help her get back on her feet. The event was a far cry from the glamorous parties Elena used to attend with David. She felt out of place among the polished attendees, her confidence eroded by months of isolation and regret. As she mingled awkwardly, she overheard snippets of conversations about David. It seemed his professional success had made him a topic of admiration. "I heard he's doing incredibly well," one attendee said. "Promoted twice in a year. And his new partner? She's amazing." Elena's chest tightened. The mention of Claire stung more than she cared to admit. Later that evening, she caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her once pristine appearance had given way to tired eyes and a forced smile. For the first time, Elena fully grasped the depth of her loss. It wasn't just about losing David, it was about losing the version of herself that had been worthy of him. David, on the other hand, had no thoughts of Elena. His focus was entirely on the present and the future. One evening, as he and Claire sat on his porch, sipping wine under a canopy of stars. She asked, "Do you ever think about her? About Elena?" David considered the question for a moment before answering. "Not really," he said honestly. "She's part of my past. But that's where she belongs. My life is better now, and I'm grateful for where I am." Claire smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You've come a long way, David, and I'm glad I get to be part of your journey." David wrapped his arm around her, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. "I am too," he said softly. Months passed, and David's life became a testament to resilience and renewal. He had found stability in his career, joy in his hobbies, and love in his relationship with Claire. Every part of his life felt intentional and vibrant, a stark contrast to the turmoil he had endured. One day, Claire surprised him with tickets to an art gala. "I thought it might be fun," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "Besides, I hear the exhibits are incredible." David agreed, intrigued by the idea of a night out with her in a setting they both enjoyed. The gala was held in an elegant venue with soaring ceilings and intricate chandeliers. Guests moved through the exhibits, admiring the art and sipping champagne. David felt a sense of calm as he walked beside Claire, her excitement infectious. But as they turned a corner, his sense of calm was interrupted. Across the room stood Elena, her expression a mix of surprise and discomfort when their eyes met. Claire noticed the shift in David's demeanor and followed his gaze. "Is that?" she began. "Yes," David said, his voice steady. "That's Elena." Elena looked away quickly, trying to avoid their gaze. She had been invited to the gala by a former colleague who had no idea about her fall from grace. Being there was supposed to be an escape, but now it felt like a cruel twist of fate. David, however, felt nothing but indifference. He turned back to Claire and smiled. "Let's move on. There's more to see." Claire nodded, slipping her hand into his as they continued exploring the exhibits. Elena watched them from a distance, her chest tightening as she saw the ease and happiness in David's demeanor. It was a stark reminder of everything she had lost. Not just David, but the life they had shared and the future she had destroyed. For the rest of the evening, she avoided crossing paths with them, but their presence lingered in her mind. Later that night, as David and Claire left the gala, she turned to him. "That must have been awkward for you," she said gently. David shook his head. "Not really. Seeing her just reminded me of how far I've come. She's part of my past. But you're my future." Claire smiled, leaning in to kiss him. "You're amazing, you know that?" David laughed softly. "I don't know about that, but I do know I'm happy, and that's enough for me." Meanwhile, Elena returned to her empty apartment, the echoes of the gala still fresh in her mind. Seeing David so happy, so fulfilled, was both a painful reminder and a wake-up call. She realized that while she had been dwelling on the past, David had been building a future. For the first time, she understood the full extent of what she had lost, and that it was something she could never get back. David's encounter with Elena at the gala became little more than a passing thought as he continued to focus on his life with Claire. Their relationship flourished, and David found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. One weekend, as they prepared dinner together in his kitchen, Claire asked, "What's something you've always wanted to do but never had the chance?" David paused, considering the question. "Travel," he said finally. "I've always wanted to see the world, but there was never time. Or maybe I just didn't prioritize it." Claire's face lit up. "Then let's do it. Let's plan a trip. Somewhere neither of us has been before." David smiled, the idea sparking excitement he hadn't felt in years. "I liked the sound of that." As they began planning their trip, David reflected on how much his priorities had shifted. The man who once felt trapped by betrayal and anger was now looking forward to new experiences, new memories, and new horizons. Meanwhile, Elena's life remained stagnant. She spent her days job hunting and her nights replaying her mistakes in her mind. Seeing David with Claire at the gala had been a painful reminder of the life she had destroyed, but it also forced her to confront the truth. She had no one to blame but herself. In a moment of desperation, Elena decided to reach out to David one last time. She sent him a carefully worded email, apologizing again and expressing her regret for everything she had done. David saw the email in his inbox but didn't feel the need to respond. He had moved on, and revisiting the past served no purpose. Instead, he deleted the message and focused on the plans he and Claire were making. The trip they planned was to Italy, a country neither of them had visited. As the departure date approached, David felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Traveling to a new place with Claire felt like a leap into the unknown. But it was a leap he was ready to take. Their journey through Italy was filled with laughter, exploration, and quiet moments of connection. Whether they were wandering the streets of Florence, sharing a gelato by the Trevi Fountain, or watching the sunset over the Amalfi Coast, every moment felt like a celebration of the life David had rebuilt. One evening, as they sat on a balcony overlooking the sea, Claire turned to David with a smile. "You know," she said, "you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Most people would let what you went through define them, but you've turned it into something beautiful." David looked at her, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. Claire shook her head. "You were strong before me. I just get to be part of the journey." Back home, Elena scrolled through social media, her heart sinking as she came across photos of David and Claire in Italy. The contrast between their happiness and her own isolation was stark. And for the first time, she realized that she had truly lost him. David had moved on, and so had his life. But Elena remained stuck in the wreckage of her choices, unable to find a way forward. Returning from their trip to Italy, David felt a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. The journey had been more than just a vacation. It had been a celebration of his new life, one built on strength, resilience, and the kind of love he never thought he'd find again. Claire had become an integral part of his world, and their bond only deepened with each passing day. Together, they shared plans for the future, dreams of new adventures, and a commitment to building a life filled with trust and joy. One evening, as they sat on the porch of David's newly renovated home, he turned to Claire with a thoughtful expression. "You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to explain," he said, "and I want you to know how much that means to me." Claire smiled, her eyes shining. "You've done the same for me, David, and I think we've only just begun." Meanwhile, Elena's life had settled into a monotonous routine. The vibrant, confident woman she once was had been replaced by someone she barely recognized. She had finally found a modest job, but it offered little fulfillment, and her social life was non-existent. She often thought about David and the life they had shared, but those memories were tainted by the choices she had made. Seeing his happiness with Claire on social media only deepened her regret. Serving as a constant reminder of what she had thrown away, Elena's attempts to reconnect with old friends and family had largely failed. Most people had distanced themselves from her after the revelations of her betrayal, unwilling to trust or invest in a relationship with someone who had caused so much pain. One afternoon, Elena walked past the small cafe where she and David had spent countless mornings during their marriage. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, hoping to recapture some semblance of the life she had lost. As she sipped her coffee, she overheard a conversation at the next table. The people were talking about a local man who had overcome immense personal challenges to rebuild his life and find happiness. "He's incredible," one of them said. "It's like he's a completely new person. I hear his fiancée is amazing, too." Elena realized they were talking about David, and her chest tightened. The conversation felt like salt in an open wound, a painful reminder that he had not only moved on but had thrived without her. For David, the past had become little more than a faint shadow. His days were filled with purpose, his nights with peace, and his future with promise. One evening, as he and Claire prepared dinner together, she turned to him with a playful smile. "Have you ever thought about what's next for us?" she asked. David laughed. "You mean beyond what we've already built?" "Exactly," she said. "What's the next big adventure?" David paused, looking at her with a mixture of affection and determination. "Whatever it is, I know one thing. We'll face it together." As the weeks turned into months, David and Claire continued to build a life filled with love, trust, and shared dreams. They became a source of inspiration for those around them, a testament to the power of resilience and the beauty of second chances. Elena, on the other hand, remained trapped in the consequences of her actions. She had hoped for redemption, but it was clear that some bridges could never be rebuilt. David's journey had been one of pain and betrayal, but it had also been one of growth and transformation. He had turned his darkest moments into stepping stones, emerging stronger and more fulfilled than ever before. As he stood on the porch of his home one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had faced the storm, weathered it, and come out on the other side. And for the first time in years, he was truly free.